Hey guys, tonight we are going to dive deep into one of the darkest mysteries of English royal history. What truly killed King Charles II, the famously enigmatic Merry Monarch? His final hours were a terrifying nightmare at Whitehall Palace. Courtiers witnessed King Charles, with his pale, ashen skin and violently convulsing body, being tormented by physicians using barbaric methods like bloodletting and the application of Spanish fly beetles. The unpleasant stench spreading throughout the bedchamber wasn't just a sign of illness. It was evidence of something rotting from the inside. But the most horrific discovery came in the final moments, when the physicians conducted the autopsy. What they found inside Charles II's body will horrify you. The final secret has been revealed. It wasn't just disease. It was a truth about chronic poisoning caused by his own mad scientific passion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening to this haunting tale from? And what time is it on your clock right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early morning of the second day of the second month in the year 1685, just as dawn's first light crept over the rooflines of Whitehall Palace, the normally hushed corridors were shattered by an unearthly scream. It rolled through the great hall like the tortured cry of a wounded soul, echoing against stone walls before fading into silence. In that instant, courtiers rushed toward the royal bedchamber, where King Charles II writhed on a velvet armchair. His body convulsed violently, his face drained of colour, his lips blue as ice, his eyes half open in an unconscious gaze that seemed to peer into the hidden anguish of a life once filled with limitless revelry. The king was immediately carried into a special examination chamber under the watchful eye of Sir Charles Scarbour, the monarch's most trusted physician. 4 days later, at 11:45 in the morning on the 6th day of the second month in the year 1685, Charles II, aged 54, drew his final breath. That moment marked the end of 25 years of rule by the sovereign known as the Merry Monarch, who had restored England from the austere Puritan Commonwealth to a lavish court, indulging in endless festivities and secret chemical experiments. Once the royal coffin was sealed, Sir Charles Scarbour and 2 other court physicians immediately began the autopsy. Their detailed report revealed the horrifying extent of the king's bodily decay. His brain was swollen with cerebrospinal fluid, until the ventricles bulged like water-filled balloons and blood vessels had burst in patches. His heart was 1.5 times its normal size, heavy and stone-like. The right lung was adhered to the chest wall by chronic inflammation, making each breath agony. The liver and spleen were engorged with blood, and his kidneys had fibrosed into hardened nodules. Gazing upon these organs, the physicians recoiled at the grisly scene where healthy pink tissue had given way to a shadowy grey of necrosis and infection. Soon rumours about the cause of the king's death spread like wildfire. Among the nobility, some insisted he had succumbed to chronic kidney disease leading to uremic poisoning, a condition in which the kidneys cannot filter urea waste, allowing toxins to accumulate in the bloodstream and trigger systemic collapse. Others pointed to his clandestine chemical work in Whitehall's secret laboratory, mercury, antimony, and other heavy metal compounds that may have entered his body in minute doses over many years, gradually destroying his kidneys and brain. Yet at that time, no one could be certain. In the medical tradition of the day, blood was believed to be the essence of life, so physicians did not hesitate to draw nearly a pint of blood the moment the king seized, confident that balancing the humours would banish disease. They also scarified his limbs to raise blisters, and administered strong purgatives and emetics containing antimony and mercury, only hastening his decline. Each time Charles II regained consciousness, he forced a weary smile and quietly apologized to his courtiers for making everyone wait so long for me to die. That nightmarish scream served as a chilling reminder of the limits of early modern medicine when superstition, forehumour theory, and brutal therapies prevailed without any real understanding of human anatomy or physiology. Meanwhile, the king himself, driven by a passion for science and alchemy, had unwittingly sown the seeds of his own ruin. The mercury burns on his hands, and his so-called minor accidents revealed themselves as the first warnings of chronic poisoning. Now the silent corridors of Whitehall and the gently flowing Thames outside were veiled in grief. The image of King Charles II, once known for dancing until dawn, lavish feasts, and fervent scientific inquiry, had become the tragic emblem of an age in which nascent science and arcane medical law intertwined to devastating effect. The tale of the scream on the second day and the ghastly autopsy would continue, unveiling deeper secrets of the merry monarch's mortal frame. But that moment stands as the beginning of a journey into the silent decay of his organs, the torment of chronic gout and leg ulcers, the horrors of cerebral edema and end-stage kidney failure. It reminds us that every scientific advance demands caution, and that sometimes the quest for discovery carries a price paid in human life. Charles II ascended the throne in 1660, restoring the English monarchy after the austere years of the Puritan Commonwealth. His reign came to be known for its lavish court, endless pageantry, and a fondness for earthly pleasures, music, dancing, poetry, and the earliest stirrings of scientific inquiry. Yet beneath that gilded mask lay a body slowly unravelling, ravaged by a constellation of hidden ailments. When Sir Charles Scarborough and his fellow physicians turned their scalpel to the late king's corpse, they documented a scene more akin to a calamity of nature than a once powerful sovereign. Every major organ system had been devastated. The brain was swollen with cerebral edema, its ventricles engorged with a viscous fluid that turned delicate neural tissue into a waterlogged sponge. The lung tissue clung tenaciously to the chest wall, the membrane fused by chronic inflammation so severe that breathing would have been sheer torment. The heart was abnormally large, 1.5 times its normal size, rock hard to the touch. The liver, spleen and kidneys were all puffed up, bleeding into themselves, their surfaces mottled with necrotic patches. Old abscesses, never properly healed, had ruptured internally, leaving scar tissue that testified to ongoing infection. Modern medical experts, peering back through centuries of mystification, believed that Charles suffered from multiple simultaneous conditions. Chronic gout had ravaged his joints and produced ulcerations on his lower legs, confining him to carriage rides instead of his much-loved walks. Mercury poisoning traced to his own unsupervised experiments with the toxic metal in Whitehall's private laboratory had inflicted irreversible damage on his kidneys and likely contributed to neurological disturbances. His kidneys' failure led to uremic poisoning, or uremia, in which waste products, normally excreted by healthy kidneys, accumulated in the blood and wreaked havoc on every organ system. Hypertension, unchecked and unrecognized in that era, had stretched his cerebral blood vessels to the breaking point, explaining the ruptured capillaries and excruciating headaches that preceded his collapse. And lurking beneath all this lay chronic infection, a slow-burning fire that scarred tissues long after initial injury. Instead of offering respite, early modern medical treatments only exacerbated the king's plight. On the first day of his final crisis, the physicians drew nearly 1 pint of blood in 2 separate sessions, guided by the humoral theory that excess blood must be purged to restore balance. They also applied blistering agents made from Cantharides beetles to his skin and administered powerful purgatives, each intervention grounded in the notion that bodily fluids must be rigorously controlled. Such measures plunged his already fragile body into severe hypovolemia and dehydration, diminishing his capacity for self-repair and hastening the build-up of toxins. In his last days, he was repeatedly given emetics, enemas, and suppositories laced with mercury or antimony, the very substances that had likely contributed to his organ damage in the first place. Yet, astonishingly, Charles maintained his characteristic wit and clarity of mind almost until the end. Upon awakening from one particularly brutal regimen, he is said to have apologized apologetically to his courtiers for making everyone wait so long for me to die. That quip, both gallant and heart-rending, masked the months of agonizing suffering he had endured in silence. This stage of his illness reveals the darkest side of royal medicine. When nascent scientific curiosity collided with entrenched superstition, the outcome was a treatment regime indistinguishable from torture. In the absence of any understanding of microbial infection, renal physiology, or the toxicology of metals, the very methods intended to heal the king inflicted fresh wounds on his battered organs. Thus, while the merry monarch retained his dignified composure and sharp humour, his body was enduring an unrelenting torment. His gout-ridden legs, the blisters and lacerations from repeated scarifications, the relentless purging all speak to a treatment philosophy that valued ancient theories of humoral balance over any semblance of patient comfort or scientific evidence. And so, as the candles guttered in the royal sick chamber and the Thames flowed quietly outside, Charles II's final days became a grim testament to the limits of early modern medicine. The juxtaposition of a sovereign's keen intellect and a body in disrepair paints a haunting portrait. A man who sought knowledge of nature's secrets, only to become a casualty of medical practices that he himself had once patronized. In that convergence of ambition and ignorance lay the tragic irony of his end, an irony that would echo through medical history as a cautionary tale of science unmoored from caution. Before departing this world, Charles II concealed the increasingly obvious signs of his decline. Courtiers observed that his once rosy complexion had faded to ashen grey, his eyes ringed with dark shadows, and his hands shook ever so slightly whenever he stood still. The king gradually abandoned his beloved promenades through St. James's Park, instead riding in a carriage to spare his ulcerated legs, the cruel legacy of chronic gout. Each agonizing step had become a torment, the ravages of gout worsening over years until open sores spread across his lower limbs, forcing him into isolation and pain. At the same time, Charles's fascination with early chemistry and alchemy led him to spend long hours in his private laboratory at Whitehall. There, he handled mercury and other toxic substances with ungloved hands, breathing in the vapors without any notion of their peril. The minor accidents that left mysterious burns on his arms were logged simply as hiccups of experimentation, but in truth they marked the outset of heavy metal poisoning. Palace servants later recounted discovering strange metallic residues coating glass retorts and vials the condensation of mercury vapors, turning the entire laboratory into an invisible haze of contamination. As weeks turned to months, the king suffered paroxysms of thunderous headaches that seemed to split his skull. Moments of bewilderment when he could not recall the name of a trusted attendant, and growing breathlessness that made each inhalation a dreadful effort. His appetite dwindled. Food that once delighted him now lay untouched. These signs pointed unmistakably to advancing kidney failure, as his body lost the ability to excrete waste products. The toxic buildup in his bloodstream manifested as dizziness and sporadic seizures, foreshadowing the final convulsions that would echo through the palace halls. Even his famed virility faltered. Charles, who had sired at least 12 acknowledged illegitimate children, no longer displayed the same vigorous desire. Whispers spread through the corridors that the king had been cursed, or bewitched rumors that took on lives of their own among the superstitious. Yet, in reality, the decline of his sexual appetite was another symptom of the systemic poisoning by mercury, which disrupts hormonal function and erodes overall vitality. Through it all, Charles strove to preserve his regal dignity and the facade of robust health. He continued to preside over court entertainments, though moved slowly past the musicians and dancers he once led with exuberance. He received ambassadors with measured courtesy, his hand resting lightly on his cane, betraying no hint of the burning aches in his joints. His closest companions note that he never complained in public. Instead, he maintained a gentle humor, offering a wry smile and a quip to mask his suffering. Yet the secrets of his torment could not remain hidden forever. On the rare occasions he ventured into the laboratory, the pungent odor of mercury clung to his robes, and assisting apothecaries found themselves dizzy in his presence. The telltale handprints where the metal had eaten into his skin became impossible to conceal. When servants cleaned the benches, they discovered globules of molten mercury in the cracks of the wood, glinting like sinister beads. These discoveries fueled hushed conversations. Was the king's downfall self-inflicted? Was this the price of curiosity unchecked by caution? Night after sleepless night, Charles's breaths grew more laboured. He would awaken in cold sweat, clutching sheets to his chest as if to stave off the spasms in his lungs. On such evenings, a few trusted attendants would find him pale and gaunt, his shoulders hunched, eyes half-lidded in a haze of exhaustion. They dared not speak of the root cause. Instead, they administered tinctures of questionable efficacy, mercury-laden camphorated spirits, pungent doses of antimonial wine, never realizing they were compounding the very poison that ravaged his internal organs. This chapter of his life illuminates the silent progression of his illness, from the first tremor of the hand to the final gasp of breath. It reveals the grim reality that a monarch, wrapped in velvet and crown, could endure months of torture while determined to shield his condition from those meant to guide and protect him. He fought a private battle against pain, infection, and toxic contamination, yet ultimately succumbed to a confluence of his own scientific zeal and the era's misguided medical dogma. In the end, the mystery of Charles II's final months lies not in whispers of poison conspiracies or supernatural retribution, but in the tragic intersection of nascent chemistry and antiquated medicine. His story serves as a somber reminder that behind the pageantry of power and the glitter of court life, a man's body can betray him in the most profound silence, and that the pursuit of knowledge, untempered by wisdom, can deliver its own dire consequences. On the second day of the second month in the year 1685, Charles II rose as usual to the pale light of dawn in Whitehall Palace. His chronic leg ulcer, a cruel sequel of long-standing gout, compelled him to forego his customary morning stroll through St. James's Park. Instead, he settled into a carved wooden carriage, its cushions stiff beneath him, and had himself conveyed through the dew-sprinkled courtyards. The hour was about 7 in the morning when the stillness of the royal residence shattered without warning. From within the king's bedchamber erupted a bestial scream, a sound that seemed to rend both flesh and spirit. Courtiers, startled from their routine, raced down the corridors toward the source. They found their sovereign slumped forward in a velvet-covered armchair, body racked by merciless convulsions. His face, once flush with vitality, was now ghostly pale. His lips, drained of colour, had taken on a leaden blue hue. For a moment, the chamber fell into terrified silence, save for the crackle of the hearth and the soft tread of anxious footfalls. Then the clamour erupted anew, hands fumbling at buttons, shutters banging, hurried voices urging for physicians. Sir Charles Scarborough arrived almost at once, supported by 2 fellow court physicians. Without pause, they set to work with the crude tools of their era. First came the lancet. They bled the king of nearly 1 pint of blood, guided by the enduring conviction that illness was caused by an imbalance of humours, and that purging excessive blood would restore harmony. Next, they turned to scarification and blistering. They crushed Canthride's beetles into a paste and spread it upon his flesh, summoning painful blisters that they believed would draw out noxious humours. When at last Charles regained a measure of consciousness, he lay dazed, head throbbing as though struck by a hammer. Nausea and vertigo overwhelmed him, leaving him too weak to speak more than a few slurred words. Yet the physicians, buoyed by fleeting signs of revival, pressed on with their regimen. They forced him to swallow emetics, meant to purge his stomach, administered strong purgatives to purge his bowels, and even introduced enemas to cleanse his lower intestines. All these acts, they believed, were essential to rebalance the precious life-bearing fluids within his body. On the second day of his affliction, a faint glimmer of improvement appeared. The king managed to consume a small piece of bread and spoke with slightly more coherence, prompting cautious optimism among his attendants. Some dared to hope that their ministrations had succeeded. In truth, this modest recovery owed itself to the crude resilience of human physiology rather than any true medical miracle. By the third morning, however, the grim pattern resumed. Convulsions returned with renewed ferocity, and headaches bore into his skull like ice-cold hammers. In response, the physicians once again let blood, this time another 8 ounces, and repeated the blistering procedures. They compounded their interventions by administering potent concoctions that included powdered human skull, antimony, and mercury substances whose toxicity today is well understood, but in that age were deemed potent remedies. All the while, the palace was cast into turmoil. Queen Catherine of Braganza held silent vigil by the king's bedside, her silken robes pooling at the edge of the bed. In an unexpected concession to desperation, some of Charles's former mistresses were permitted to appear, their presence a testament to the severity of his condition. Among the chaos, the king's characteristic humour flickered through the haze of suffering. At one point he murmured to his brother, "Let not poor Nelly starve," a tender thought for his beloved Nell Gwyn, even as he lay racked by pain. And later, with a faint, rueful smile, he apologised to the assembled courtiers for making everyone wait so long for me to die. These final hours reveal a stark portrait of early modern medicine's blind zeal. Bloodletting, blistering, emetics, purges all administered with unshakable faith in ancient theories that saw the body as a vessel of 4 humours to be balanced at any cost. Yet in practice, these interventions inflicted suffering akin to torture, further weakening a body already beset by gout, kidney failure, and heavy metal poisoning. As the afternoon sun slanted through the chamber's high windows, casting long shadows across the dais. Charles II's breath grew ever more ragged. His attendants, once full of hope at the slightest sign of recovery, now moved with subdued dread. The chords of the king's voice grew slack. His once commanding presence dwindled to a mere whisper of what had been. In that hushed royal bedchamber, the curtain fell on the final act of a monarch who had reigned with exuberance and curiosity. His sudden collapse laid bare the tragic limits of contemporary medicine and the enduring human will to persevere, even as every breath became a struggle. Through blood and blister, emetic and purge, Charles II's indomitable spirit shone, funneled into wry jokes and gentle remonstrances, until at last the tumult gave way to stillness, and the merry monarch slipped quietly into history's embrace. After Charles II drew his final breath at midday on the 6th day of the second month in the year 1685, Sir Charles Scarborough, the king's most trusted physician, immediately set about conducting a post-mortem examination. The motive was twofold: to allay rampant whispers of foul play, and to uncover the true cause of death. First, the scalpel severed the scalp and skull, revealing a chilling scene beneath. The brain's blood vessels were grotesquely distended, engorged far beyond anything a healthy vessel could withstand. Cerebrospinal fluid had flooded the ventricles, filling them like overfilled pouches, and the brain tissue itself appeared swollen as though submerged in a murky broth. These findings spoke unmistakably of severe cerebral edema, a condition in which the brain literally drowns in its own fluids, explaining the king's relentless headaches and the violent convulsions that heralded his final collapse. Turning from head to chest, Scarborough and his colleagues peeled back the ribcage to expose the respiratory and cardiovascular systems. The right lung was found fused to the interior chest wall, the pleural membranes glued together by chronic inflammation. Such adhesions suggested years of insidious pulmonary distress, making the act of breathing a torment of tearing tissue. The heart itself was alarmingly enlarged and rock solid to the touch, a clear indicator of long-standing cardiovascular strain. It had labored under the weight of failing organs and circulating toxic blood, forced to pump furiously just to sustain minimal circulation. The exploration of the abdominal cavity yielded equally dramatic revelations. The liver, spleen, and kidneys were uniformly swollen, their parenchyma congested with blood, the surfaces mottled by patches of necrotic tissue. In particular, the kidneys bore the worst scars. They were riddled with fibrotic nodules and hemorrhagic streaks, confirming what had long been suspected by modern scholars: chronic kidney disease, culminating in uremic poisoning. In uremia, the kidney's inability to filter urea and other metabolic wastes allows toxins to accumulate in the bloodstream, wreaking havoc on multiple organ systems and manifesting as confusion, nausea, breathing difficulty, and generalized weakness. Scattered within these organs were unmistakable remnants of old abscesses, pockets of pus that had formed and ruptured internally, leaving behind tracks of scar tissue. Such evidence of past infections suggested that the king's body had been under constant microbial siege, his weakened state unable to fully quell the flames of inflammation. Instead of the healthy pink-red hue expected in living organs, the tissues had taken on a ghastly grey pallor, their colour emblematic of decay rather than life. A pungent, rancid odour arose from the open cavities, far more intense than ordinary post-mortem decomposition, alerting the physicians to the extraordinary degree of internal putrefaction. Perhaps most damning was the detection of heavy metal contaminants. Scraping samples of tissue and fluid, Sir Charles Scarborough found granular deposits that, upon rudimentary chemical analysis, tested positive for mercury. These metallic residues, likely the byproduct of the king's own alchemical experiments, had accumulated in vital organs over time, supporting the theory that his private laboratory had, in effect, been a slow-acting poison chamber. The presence of mercury in the brain, kidneys, and even the liver provided chilling confirmation that his passion for early chemistry had exacted a lethal toll on his health. The political ramifications of these findings were immediate. While some hoped the autopsy would quell talk of assassination plots, others seized upon the ambiguity to stoke fears of a courtly conspiracy. Rumours swirled that Prince James had orchestrated a nefarious scheme to secure the throne. Yet the hard evidence pointed instead to a far more tragic culprit: a combination of rudimentary scientific inquiry and brutal medical practices. Rather than a dagger's blade or poison in a chalice, it was the unchecked fusion of dangerous metals in the king's laboratory and the extreme measures of early modern medicine, bloodletting, blistering, toxic purgatives that had conspired to bring about his demise. In that stark examination chamber, the juxtaposition of regal pageantry and visceral decay could not have been more pronounced. The king who once revelled in glittering court banquets and midnight alchemical pursuits now lay exposed in the raw reality of his own bodily destruction. Sir Charles Scarborough's meticulous records detailing vessel distension, organ adhesions, necrotic tissue, and metallic residues would endure as one of the most comprehensive autopsy reports of the 17th century, a grim testament to the limits of contemporary medicine and the unintended cornerstones of modern pathology and toxicology. Thus did Charles II's mortal remains speak a final truth, that the real villain of his story was neither conjured curse nor clandestine assassin, but the deadly intersection of early chemical experimentation and misguided therapeutic dogma. The tale of his post-mortem revelations would echo through the halls of medical history, a somber reminder that in the quest for knowledge, the greatest danger can lie within one's own laboratory and the trusted hands of those who seek to heal. The conclusion of the autopsy did more than clarify the medical cause of death. It ignited a firestorm of political conspiracy. Charles II died at a moment when England was bitterly divided along confessional lines. His successor, Prince James, was a Roman Catholic, while Parliament and the vast majority of the populace adhered to the Church of England. The abruptness of the king's final convulsions, his collapse and passing transpiring within mere hours, led many to believe that a foreign power or an extremist faction within the Catholic community had poisoned him to accelerate James's accession to the throne. Yet even among the royal physicians, uncertainty prevailed. In an age when the concept of blood pressure was unknown, renal physiology uncharted, and heavy metal toxicity poorly understood, no consensus emerged on whether mercury from the king's private laboratory could erode his kidneys so severely as to trigger seizures and fatal brain swelling. Their official report meticulously catalogued only the observable injuries: ruptured cerebral vessels, enlarged and fibrotic kidneys, a heart of abnormal size and firmness, and lungs fused to the chest wall by chronic inflammation. These stark findings, recorded in fine penmanship on parchment, laid bare the condition of the king's body without attributing blame for its decline. When the report was released to the court and subsequently to the broader realm, it artfully sidestepped any direct mention of the alchemical endeavours that had likely seeded the king's decline. Instead, it offered a measured attribution to chronic maladies and complications arising from treatment. Such phrasing was convenient. It acknowledged disease and medical intervention without implicating the monarch's own scientific pursuits. Nevertheless, rumours of intentional poisoning swept through noble circles and common taverns alike. Members of Parliament, sensing opportunity, invoked these speculations to bolster the passage of the King's Catholic Restriction Act, a measure aimed at limiting the prerogatives of a Catholic sovereign and reinforcing the supremacy of Protestant-led legislation over royal prerogative. Simultaneously, physicians and scholars on the continent and in England began to cite Charles II's case as a textbook example of a compound pathological syndrome. They noted the confluence of factors, environmental toxins such as mercury and antimony, a diet excessively rich in meat and wine predisposing one to gout, and the deleterious side effects of blistering and bloodletting therapies that combined to devastate the king's health. At medical schools from Leiden to Edinburgh, instructors incorporated the detailed observations from Whitehall into lectures on toxicology and pathology. The grisly autopsy findings became didactic tools for demonstrating the dangers of unregulated chemical exposure and the need for empirical methods in diagnosing disease. In the decade that followed, medical practitioners began to re-examine traditional humoral theory in light of this high-profile example. They conducted rudimentary experiments measuring the effects of metal salts on animal tissues and advocated for more cautious use of blistering agents. Physicians petitioned for standardized records of patient symptoms and treatment outcomes, marking a shift from purely theoretical medicine toward one grounded in observation and documentation. The notion that a sovereign's private laboratory could double as a source of lethal contamination underscored the broader imperative that scientific inquiry must be accompanied by rigorous safety protocols. Moreover, The political aftershocks of Charles II's death continued to reverberate. The spectre of a poisoned monarch fed into the broader Protestant anxiety about Catholic plots, reinforcing calls for a Protestant succession and shaping the conditions for the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The fear that James's reign might be similarly imperiled by covert conspirators served both to justify Parliament's assertiveness and to codify the principle that the monarch's authority was subject to the law of the land. Thus, the autopsy at Whitehall not only exposed the tragic end of England's merry monarch, but also catalyzed a transformation in both medical practice and political theory. The brutal clarity of the internal findings: edematous brain tissue, fused lungs, enlarged and putrid organs riddled with scar tissue, and metallic residues spoke louder than any oath or denial. They provided a stark, unvarnished case study that propelled 18th century medicine away from mystical humours and toward a discipline rooted in empirical evidence. In the halls of Parliament, they lent weight to arguments for constitutional checks on royal power, and in the corridors of Whitehall, they left an enduring reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, untempered by caution, can have consequences as lethal as any conspiracy. The medical legacy of Charles II endures most hauntingly in the tales of his private laboratory at Whitehall Palace. Situated within the very heart of royal residence, the chamber was filled with glass retorts, lead-lined crucibles, mercury baths heated by small furnaces, and bellows-driven gas burners. Court officers later recounted that the king would spend hours there amid poor ventilation, inhaling toxic vapors and handling mercury compounds bare-handed in pursuit of disinfectants, or, as he fancifully termed it, the creation of the philosopher's stone. Secret laboratory journals, preserved under lock and key, noted the occasional puddles of liquid mercury dripping from apparatus stands and congealing into dense beads at the bottom of flasks. Yet these entries remained confidential, accessible only to a few trusted aides. It was only during the post-mortem examination that Sir Charles Scarbour and his colleagues detected unmistakable traces of mercury residue deep within the king's renal tissue and even within the folds of cerebral matter. The physician's terse official statement recorded that they had identified an unfamiliar corrosive substance in the organs, a heavy metal deposit that no natural disease process could explain. Though they lacked the chemical knowledge to fully elucidate the mechanism, they surmised that years of exposure had allowed the mercury to accumulate progressively, like a slow-burning beacon, forewarning an impending collapse of health. Throughout his 25-year reign, Charles II had also endured the relentless torment of chronic gout. The disease first manifested with sudden excruciating pain in his toes, then spread to his ankles and knees, producing ulcerations so severe that walking became unthinkable. By the winter of 1684, the ulcers had festered into open, oozing wounds, forcing him to abandon his cherished morning promenades through St. James's Park. Instead, he rode solemnly in his gilded carriage, the circulation in his legs severely impaired by prolonged immobility, an unfortunate condition that exacerbated the body's inability to clear toxins. On many nights, courtiers claimed they could hear his anguished cries echoing through the corridors, not only from gout but from his heart and lungs, contracting painfully under the strain of infection and edema. In the aftermath of his death, the Whitehall Laboratory and the royal medical practices of the era became enduring symbols of the maxim that no one should experiment upon oneself. Charles's tragic end was seen as a cautionary tale. The pursuit of scientific knowledge divorced from safety and ethics could prove deadly. In the centuries that followed, scholars and physicians reflected on the king's example as a dire warning against unregulated chemical experimentation. The man who had sought to unlock the universe's hidden secrets ultimately unwittingly poisoned himself. At the same time, the meticulous descriptions of his cerebral pathology, relentless hammer-like headaches, waves of nausea and vomiting, episodes of disorientation, and uncontrollable tremors became invaluable case studies for distinguishing neurological disorders from toxic syndromes. Medical faculties in England began to emphasize the importance of tissue sampling and microscopic examination of diseased organs, rather than reliance on the ancient theory of the four humours alone. Students were urged to collect small biopsies from suspected sites of pathology, to catalogue fluid accumulations, and to correlate clinical symptoms with physical findings during autopsy. In this way, the haunting records of Charles II's final illness and autopsy helped usher in a new era of empirical medicine, grounded in observation, documentation, and the nascent principles of pathology. By scrutinizing the king's ordeal, the corrosive heavy metals lingering in his kidneys, the festering ulcers of gout, the adhesive lung membranes, and the swollen, fluid-laden brain, medical practitioners recognized the necessity of separating scientific curiosity from personal risk. Laboratories were reconfigured with ventilation hoods, protective gloves, and glass barriers. Chemical handling protocols were formalized. The phrase "philosopher's stone" gave way to more precise nomenclature for reagents and compounds, and apprentices were instructed to maintain detailed logs of exposure and symptoms. Thus, the grim chronicles of Charles II's laboratory obsession and the tragic unfolding of his multiple ailments became the foundation for improved medical training and laboratory safety across Europe. His name, once synonymous with revelry and royal splendor, came also to evoke the perils of unchecked experimentation and the transformative power of empirical inquiry. Even in the hush of a late-night lecture hall, as young physicians leaf through bound volumes of 17th-century autopsy notes, the memory of the merry monarch's final descent into poisoning and pain serves as a somnolent reminder that progress demands both courage and caution. The political landscape in England, already scarred by decades of religious strife, grew ever more turbulent as news of King Charles II's autopsy spread through the land. The Protestant-dominated Parliament seized upon rumours of poisoning as a potent weapon against both Catholic influence and the Tory faction sympathetic to James Stuart, the new monarch's Catholic younger brother. Heated debates raged within the House of Commons on whether James should be deemed fit to inherit the throne, given widespread suspicions that he or those close to him had conspired to hasten his brother's demise. Although the physicians' findings clearly pointed to chronic kidney failure and mercury accumulation as the medical causes of death, the streets of London teemed with whispers of Vatican devils, Jesuit priests allegedly lurking in shadowy corners, plotting regicide to elevate a Catholic king. These sensational accusations were eagerly amplified by the Whig Party, which argued that only by restricting Catholic civil rights could England safeguard its Protestant heritage. They pushed for stringent statutes to limit the powers of a Catholic sovereign, insisting that James publicly renounce any claim to absolute authority over church and state. In Whitehall, the newly crowned James II found himself in a precarious position. On one hand, he celebrated the successful accession that a sudden death had made possible. On the other, he faced a torrent of anti-Catholic sentiment that threatened to destabilize his rule from the outset. Determined to consolidate his position, James moved swiftly to install fellow Catholics into key offices, judgeships, ambassadorial posts, and high-ranking military commands. This strategy only deepened the unease of his Protestant subjects, who viewed each new appointment as further evidence of a looming Catholic takeover. The unresolved mystery of Charles's death, the so-called mysterious demise of the merry monarch, served as a catalyst for what would become known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Disaffected nobles and gentry, alarmed by the perceived drift toward Catholic absolutism, invited William of Orange to intervene. When William landed on English shores with a sizable army, James's fragile coalition of supporters melted away. His flight from the throne marked the end of Stuart hegemony and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy under William and Mary. Meanwhile, the tragic end of Charles II found rich expression in the theatrical and literary culture of the era. Playwrights and pamphleteers wove accounts of his agonizing cerebral edema, ulcerated legs, and violent convulsions into works of biting satire aimed at both royal authority and the high-handed practices of court physicians. John Dryden's contemporaneous verses alluded to the monarch's tortured frame as a metaphor for misgovernance, while anonymous ballads referred to him as the King of Screams, whose final cries still haunted the corridors of Whitehall. Newspapers, those fledgling gazettes distributed by hawkers on street corners, printed lurid headlines about barbarous bloodletting and blistering atrocities inflicted in the name of healing. Editorial cartoons depicted doctors brandishing lancets and cantharides paced like instruments of torture, their wigs askew, standing over a prone monarch. In coffeehouses and taverns, men recited speeches mocking the alleged infallibility of royal physicians who measured life with beakers and retorts, consigning the king to a fate more dreadful than any conspiracy might have wrought. This fusion of political polemic and popular culture cemented Charles II's posthumous reputation as both a cautionary tale of medical hubris and a symbol of the dangers inherent in unchecked monarchical power. His suffering, so vividly chronicled by first-hand accounts of mistimed bloodletting, blistering compounds, and toxic alchemical fumes, became a moral lesson for audiences across the realm. No longer could the sanctity of the crown shield its holders from reproach. Even the sovereign was subject to the scrutiny of a people armed with pen, pamphlet, and petition. Thus, the autopsy findings did more than solve a royal mystery, they helped redraw the contours of English governance. By linking the king's demise to a toxic blend of flawed science and questionable politics, contemporaries underscored the necessity of constitutional limits on both medical authority and sovereign prerogative. In the quiet hush of a 17th-century lecture hall, aspiring physicians pored over detailed sketches of edematous brains and fused lungs, while political theorists invoked the merry monarch's final agony to justify a new social contract, a monarchy bound by law, and a realm safeguarded against the spectre of clandestine plots and the tyranny of unfettered power. Over the past 3 centuries, scholars of medicine and history have continued to debate the mysterious death of Charles II. Approximately 50 years after the monarch's passing, in the year 1735, the physician and medical author Tobias Venner invoked the so-called Whitehall case as a cautionary exemplar of outdated medical practices and the perils of lacking a systematic scientific method. In his widely read treatise, Venner lamented the reliance on humoral theory and blind faith in therapies that he believed may inflict more harm than the maladies they purport to cure. His analysis, published half a century after the fateful February of 1685, ignited renewed interest in the king's final illness and autopsy report. By the 19th century, with the advent of blood pressure measurement and advanced anatomical study, medical scholars reached a consensus. Recurrent cerebral edema and chronic kidney failure lay at the heart of Charles's demise. Detailed re-examination of the original 1685 autopsy documentation revealed descriptions of a brain drowned in its own fluids, remarkably similar to modern cases of severe traumatic brain injury. Pioneering pathologists compared these notes to late-stage renal failure syndromes, demonstrating that elevated blood urea levels, a condition known today as uremia, can precipitate acute confusion, violent convulsions, and rapid death. Moreover, contemporary toxicologists revisited the reports of mercury burns and chemical exposure, confirming that chronic contact with metallic mercury produces irreversible lesions in skin and internal organs alike. The philosopher John Locke, whose intellectual circle included physicians and natural philosophers, made passing reference to the king's chemical obsessions in his writings on human understanding. Locke cautioned against the insidious harm of unregulated chemical agents, noting that the greatest genius may unwittingly become a victim of the substances he admires. Even today, fragments of Whitehall's Royal Laboratory survive in the vaults of the British Museum, their surfaces bearing microscopic traces of lead and mercury that attest to the enduring legacy of the tragedy. Beyond its medical import, the case of Charles II became a powerful symbol of power turned inward. Here was a sovereign who pursued knowledge with unbridled enthusiasm yet remained oblivious to fundamental safety principles, ultimately sowing the seeds of his own destruction. In the lectures of late Victorian medical schools, the king's story featured prominently as a stark lesson that scientific ambition, when severed from ethics and precaution, can exact a terrible price. Students pored over reconstitutions of the Whitehall autopsy, marveling that a man who presided over Versailles-style banquets and midnight alchemical experiments could so gravely misjudge the risks he courted. By the early 20th century, the Whitehall syndrome had entered the lexicon of toxicology, denoting a condition in which cumulative low-level exposure to noxious substances produces systemic organ failure. Regulatory bodies in Britain and beyond cited the king's case when drafting early workplace safety legislation, establishing maximum allowable limits for metallic vapors and mandating ventilation in chemical laboratories. The notion that an investigator might unwittingly become both author and subject of his own study resonated deeply with a scientific community increasingly aware of occupational hazards. In literary and cultural commentary, Charles II's fate also served as a metaphor for the perils of unchecked authority. Poets and playwrights of the early 20th century echoed 17th century verse in depicting the king's final agony as emblematic of absolute power's vulnerability. His swollen limbs and trembling hands, etched in countless medical atlases, became ghostly figures in novels exploring the clash between progress and human frailty. The chapter on his autopsy appeared alongside accounts of industrial accidents and early findings in bacteriology, underscoring the interconnected evolution of medical science and social responsibility. Today, the Merry Monarch is remembered not only for his restoration of the English throne, but also for the cautionary tale his death embodies. Annual retrospectives in medical journals revisit the Whitehall findings, presenting them as case studies in both pathology and ethics. Conferences on the history of medicine often feature panels entitled Charles II's Legacy, From Humours to Hemodynamics, tracing the arc from 17th century speculations to modern renal and neurological care. Students of medical history learn that the blending of curiosity with carelessness can turn the pursuit of truth into a perilous gambit. Thus, over 3 centuries of inquiry, from Venner's early critique of pseudoscience through 19th century anatomical revelations to 20th century safety reforms, the death of Charles II has remained a lodestar guiding the evolution of medical thought. His story, part anatomical puzzle and part moral fable, continues to remind us that the noblest quest for knowledge demands not only intellect and courage, but also the humility to recognize and respect the boundaries of human vulnerability. In the quiet hush of a modern hospital's research lab, one can almost hear the echoes of Whitehall's cries, a somnolent warning that progress, unchecked by prudence, may come at too high a cost. Drawing lessons for future generations, the death of Charles II stands as a stark testament that scientific progress cannot be divorced from ethical responsibility and safety measures. From the ghastly dissection chamber of Whitehall to the mercury-laden benches of the Royal Laboratory, his story reminds us that every novel discovery must be accompanied by rigorous protections. In the realm of medicine, the Whitehall tragedy spurred England to pioneer more stringent royal health oversight. Within a decade of the king's passing, the court's medical bureau mandated the first principles of antisepsis, boiling surgical instruments, storing them in sterile linens, and requiring physicians to wash their hands and tools before examination. Blood pressure measurement then in its infancy became standard practice in the royal clinics, offering the first quantitative gauge of cardiovascular health. Meanwhile, departments of pathology began preserving tissue samples in alcohol and paraffin, creating archives of human organs that could be studied under the microscope. These preserved specimens provided the raw material for early experimental medicine, laying the groundwork for systematic correlations between clinical symptoms and anatomical findings. In essence, the autopsy record that had once merely documented death became the cornerstone of living medicine. Politically, the demise of the Merry Monarch underscored the inherent limitations of absolute rule. The spectre of a king felled not by rebellion or duel, but by a fatal combination of flawed science and outdated treatments, demonstrated that even the most exalted sovereign could not outrun the universal cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death. The succession crisis that followed, charged with anti-Catholic fervour and parliamentary angst, paved the way for the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That bloodless upheaval affirmed the supremacy of Parliament's legislative authority over royal prerogative, thus inaugurating a constitutional monarchy that balanced regal dignity with the rule of law. In this light, Charles's tragic end becomes more than a medical footnote. It is the hinge upon which modern British governance turned. Socially, Charles II's fate served as a dire caution against unchecked passion. Plays like The Alchemist's Curse, performed at Drury Lane Theatre, dramatised the king's laboratory excesses and his final screams, reminding audiences that the quest for forbidden knowledge can bring ruin. Poets penned elegies portraying his swollen limbs and convulsive throes as metaphors for ambition's deadly edge. Chroniclers wove the tale of the King of Screams into the tapestry of folklore, passing it along in whispered warnings to children and travellers. When you hear a lonely wail in the corridors after midnight, remember Whitehall's ghost and the price of overweening curiosity. Even today, the legend persists in English cultural memory. Tour guides at the palace ruins recount how the walls once reverberated with the monarch's terror, framing the story as a universal allegory. that the human mind's yearning for discovery must always be tempered by humility and foresight. In local pubs, patrons still recommend hours of sleep to soothe restless nerves, jesting that sleeplessness breeds phantoms of Whitehall's final moments. From a king who pored over retorts and crucibles to a tragic figure in history, Charles II and his death convey a poignant message. Knowledge without responsibility exacts a bloody toll, sometimes from the discoverer, sometimes from those he sought to help. In this final chapter of the Merry Monarch saga, where science, politics, and destiny intertwine, his story leaves an indelible mark on British history and the global practice of medicine. May it stand forever as a reminder that progress must walk hand in hand with prudence, lest the price of discovery become someone's ultimate sacrifice. Thus, after witnessing the heartrending scenes of the autopsy chamber and the torture-like treatments, Charles II's story still echoes in every bruise and faltering heartbeat. His harrowing scream and those deadly remedies not only closed the final chapter of the Merry Monarch, but also pointed the way to 5 medical mysteries, 5 silent afflictions that gradually sapped the crown's vitality. First ailment, chronic gout, the royal agony. In the year 1666, on a quiet morning at Whitehall Palace, Charles II experienced a sudden, stabbing pain in the joint of his left big toe. Simply placing his foot on the cold marble floor caused him to recoil in agony, his face paling. The royal physicians diagnosed it as podagra, an acute form of gout attributed to the crystallization of uric acid around the joint. To Charles, however, this was merely the beginning of years of relentless suffering. Over the ensuing decades, the gout did not remain confined to his big toe. By the winter of 1668, the attacks had spread to his ankles, knees, and eventually his fingers. No longer could he stroll through St. James's Park as he once did. Courtiers observed him limping into the state chambers, leaning heavily on pillars, his gaze dimmed by pain. He became dependent on a walking stick, each step a fresh torment. By 1684, chronic gout had eroded the soft tissues around his joints, producing open ulcers on both calves. The skin around these wounds darkened to a bruised purple, then cracked and bled. Secondary infections set in, oozing foul-smelling pus that stained the finest silks of his carriage seat. To spare his flesh further trauma, Charles abandoned walking entirely and rode in his gilded carriage through the silent stone courtyards, every jolt amplifying his wound's agony. Court records reveal the toll on his spirit. Where once his laughter had filled the halls, now only a forced half-smile appeared when he entered the throne room. Private letters show his despondence. "My legs betray me with unending misery," he confided to a friend. He declined invitations to hunting parties and delayed evening entertainments, spending hours in solitary chambers rather than among his revelling courtiers. Contemporary treatments, based on the 4 humour theory, proved as cruel as they were ineffectual. Physicians first administered powerful purgatives, concoctions of gamboge and scammony, inducing hours of violent diarrhea, leaving him dehydrated and feeble. Next came herbal diuretics, waters infused with parsley and juniper berries, believed to flush uric acid from his system, yet only further exhausted him and reduced his urine output. Bloodletting was a staple remedy. In acute attacks, Charles relinquished up to 8 ounces of blood per session, sometimes twice in a single day, under the assumption that removing excess blood would quell inflammation. The repeated lancing failed to heal cleanly, and the bleeding wounds worsened, prolonging his ulcers. Physicians then applied blistering agents made from crushed cantharides beetles. Pustules swelled into watery blisters that broke open like teardrops, inflicting chemical burns so painful that he required scarce doses of opiate remedies. Daily dressings of plantain leaves and ground oats were spread over his lesions and covered with warm bandages, yet the wounds perpetually leaked and sloughed. When mercury ointment was applied for its presumed antiseptic properties, Charles lamented, "I feel as though I burned beside a bed of coals," and the treated skin became calloused and numb, leaving permanent, dark scars. The royal diet, too, was drastically restricted. Once lavish feasts of venison and wine gave way to thin broths, cold rice gruels, and hard biscuits. The king's taste for fine dining vanished along with his reputation as the Merry Monarch. He often declined banquet invitations, preferring the company of pillows in his bedchamber. Despite his affliction, Charles maintained regal courtesy. When visitors arrived, he would murmur, "My legs do not allow it," then offer a wan smile. Attendants discreetly placed extra cushions beneath him and adjusted his throne to conceal the ulcers, though their concerned glances betrayed their sympathy. From the spring when he first felt that fiery pain to his final days, chronic gout haunted Charles II from age 35 onward, inflicting not just physical torment but emotional shadow. The era's remedies, purgatives, diuretics, bloodletting, blistering, exemplify how medical practice, without scientific understanding and humane care, can amplify suffering. The tragic lesson of the Merry Monarch remains a somber reminder that medicine must be guided by evidence, compassion, and safety, lest it become an instrument of torture rather than healing. Second ailment: chronic kidney failure and uremic poisoning. While chronic gout tormented Charles II's joints, another malady silently undermined his life from within: progressive kidney failure, culminating in uremic poisoning. By the early 1860s, 1763, court physicians began noting signs of diminished urine output and persistent fatigue, symptoms that, at the time, defied clear explanation. For decades, the sovereign had laboured under these degenerative changes, unaware that his kidneys were steadily losing their ability to filter waste. The first whisper of renal trouble emerged in the autumn of 1668, when Charles complained of persistent nausea and an unquenchable thirst. Physicians attributed these complaints to residual effects of his gout treatments. Purgatives and diuretics had unsettled his digestive balance. Yet, by the winter of 1682, the king's attendants recorded that he awoke frequently at midnight, stumbling toward a chamber pot, only to find scant droplets of urine. His ankles and eyelids bore mild swelling, so subtle that it escaped most courtly eyes, but not those trained to observe royal health. Over the next 3 years, these disturbances compounded. By the spring of 1685, Charles's weight had dropped noticeably, and his complexion turned a sallow yellow. He complained of lingering headaches and shortness of breath upon minimal exertion, such as ascending the palace staircase to the council chamber. These symptoms reflected the accumulation of urea and other nitrogenous wastes, metabolites his failing kidneys could no longer excrete. In modern terms, he suffered from chronic renal insufficiency, progressing to end-stage renal disease, with subsequent uremia manifesting as systemic toxicity. The post-mortem examination, conducted on the morning of the 7th day of February in the year 1685, revealed kidneys shrunken and scarred fibrotic nodules replaced the healthy, bean-shaped parenchyma. Historians reading Sir Charles Scarborough's detailed notes found descriptions of firm, greyish tissue riddled with hemorrhagic streaks and dilated vessels. Scarborough himself wrote that the organ resembled stone hardened by years of unseen strife, confirming what modern nephrologists recognize as end-stage glomerulosclerosis. The surrounding capsule was thickened and adherent, a testament to prolonged inflammation likely aggravated by mercury toxicity and chronic dehydration. Clinically, the king's uremia produced a constellation of distressing symptoms. His private correspondence hints at episodes of confusion once. While meeting with ambassadors in November of 1684, he paused mid-sentence, brow furrowed as if searching for a lost thought. These mental fogs, now understood as uremic encephalopathy, arose from elevated blood urea nitrogen, crossing the blood-brain barrier and disrupting neural function. Nausea and intermittent vomiting plagued him, depriving his already weakened body of nutrition and sapping his strength. As uremic toxins built up, Charles experienced muscle cramps and tremors, especially in the limbs afflicted by gout ulcers, compounding his agony. He reported a persistent metallic taste in his mouth and episodes of restless legs at night, both classic signs of azotemia. Insomnia became routine, and he often sat awake, staring into candlelit halls as a dull headache pulsed behind his eyes, another hallmark of severe uremia. Treatment options for kidney disease in the 17th century were virtually non-existent. Physicians continued to employ bloodletting and diuretics, unwittingly exacerbating his fluid and electrolyte imbalances. When Charles received mercurial compounds as part of anti-gout regimens, the mercury further damaged kidney tubules, accelerating his decline. The very practices intended to heal him instead hastened the loss of nephron function. Desperate measures in his final months included herbal purgatives to cleanse the body of toxic humours and enemas, to stimulate elimination. None addressed the underlying renal failure. The king's lifestyle, heavy drinking, rich diet, and exposure to laboratory toxins provided no respite for his ailing kidneys. His physicians lacked knowledge of dialysis or transplantation. They could only document the steady deterioration until the toxic buildup triggered convulsions and coma. In the broader tapestry of Charles II's health, chronic kidney failure and the resulting uremic poisoning stands as a silent killer. It undermined his physical resilience, clouded his mind, and left him vulnerable to the fatal convulsions that claimed his life. His case would later serve as a landmark for renal pathology, urging future generations of physicians to seek therapies grounded in physiology rather than humoral speculation. The tragic arc of his kidney disease revealed the limitations of early modern medicine and the necessity of scientific rigor. It foretold the importance of measuring blood urea, monitoring fluid balance, and understanding renal function principles that would only emerge centuries later. For Charles II, the insidious march of kidney failure proved more relentless than any battlefield foe, a reminder that the most vital organs can betray their keeper when knowledge falls short of compassion and science. Third ailment: mercury poisoning, the ghost of the royal laboratory. Amid the lavish pace of life at Whitehall Palace, Charles II spent long hours in the royal laboratory pursuing rudimentary chemical experiments. Beginning in the year 1665, he took a particular interest in mercury, quicksilver, in alchemical texts, believing it could serve as a disinfectant or even be transmuted into the philosopher's stone. Yet every time Charles handled mercury with bare hands, inhaled its vapors, or combined it with sulfur and nitric acid, he unknowingly poisoned himself. The laboratory journals, kept strictly confidential, record numerous instances of liquid mercury droplets pooling on stands and coalescing into gleaming beads overnight. Technicians often found residues coating the necks of flasks, but no warnings were sounded. Meanwhile, Charles bore strange burns and lesions on the backs of his hands and forearms dismissed as minor accidents, but in reality, the earliest signs of heavy metal toxicity. From a modern biochemical perspective, mercury enters the body through skin absorption and inhalation, accumulating primarily in the kidneys and brain. Today's toxicologists refer to this as micromercurialism, a chronic, low-level exposure syndrome. The court took note of the king's occasional hand tremors when lifting a full goblet of wine, or the need for an attendant to steady his hand when manipulating a retort. Increasingly intense headaches, persistent fatigue, and sporadic confusion became hallmarks of his condition. The post-mortem examination on the 7th day of February, in the year 1685, confirmed mercury residues in both renal and cerebral tissue. Sir Charles Scarborough recorded nodules of firm, grey kidney tissue encrusted with metallic deposits and hemorrhagic streaks around the tubules. The brain, already swollen from cerebral edema, contained visible mercury particulates lodged in the grey matter, evidence of years of insidious chemical damage. Clinically, Charles complained of dizziness, nausea, and occasional vertigo upon standing. He suffered chronic insomnia, his once rosy complexion giving way to a pallid, ashen hue. Private correspondence describes him spending hours hunched over in the laboratory, his hands immersed in mercury solutions, only to return to the palace gaunt and listless. His unbridled scientific zeal thus proved a fatal liability. No effective treatment for mercury poisoning existed at the time. Physicians resorted to scarification, bloodletting, and herbal renal tonics, or mild laxatives, measures wholly unable to remove mercury from tissue, and at times exacerbating organ damage by inducing dehydration and reducing blood flow to vital structures. His central nervous system also suffered. Military dispatches describe occasions when he paused mid-briefing, disoriented, unable to recall key strategic details, a modern hallmark of mercury-induced neurotoxicity, disrupting neurotransmission and memory. The court attempted to conceal his deteriorating condition. In late-life portraits, the king's hands are artfully posed to hide scars and lesions. Yet the metallic spectre of mercury poisoning, imperceptible to the eye, proved the true architect of his decline. By the year 1685, the convergence of chronic gout, progressive kidney failure, and mercury toxicity had created an unassailable triple threat. When the final convulsions struck, the mercury burden was sufficient to trigger neuroexcitatory spasms and overwhelm his brain's capacity to sustain life. It was then that Charles II uttered his fateful, harrowing scream before collapsing for the last time. This tragic episode imparts an enduring lesson in chemical safety. Personal protective equipment, adequate ventilation, and rigorous toxicological study are indispensable. Charles II, driven by a thirst to unlock chemical mysteries, became the first victim of unfettered experimentation. The ghost of Mercury at Whitehall remains a timeless caution. In the battle against toxic substances, intelligence must be matched by prudence. Fourth ailment: hypertension and cardiovascular disease, the heart under siege. By the mid-1680s, alongside his chronic gout and insidious kidney failure, Charles II began to exhibit signs of a failing cardiovascular system. Court physicians noted that he frequently experienced episodes of breathlessness upon minimal exertion, such as ascending the narrow staircase to the Privy Council chamber, and complained of a persistent tightness in his chest. Though they lacked the tools to measure blood pressure, they described his pulse as full and bounding, a precursor to what modern clinicians recognize as untreated hypertension. In the year 1682, following a state banquet, Charles was observed pausing for breath, hand pressed to his chest, eyes closed. Attendants recalled the moment as a rare display of vulnerability. Within months, his stamina waned. Ceremony processions, which he once led with ease, now saw him leaning on armrests, his alabaster countenance flushed as though feverish. On the morning of the autopsy 7th of February, 1685, Sir Charles Scarbour and his colleagues found the king's heart to be remarkably enlarged, measuring 1.5 times the size expected for a man of his stature. The organ's walls were thickened and firm, a condition known as concentric hypertrophy, indicative of a heart laboring against chronically elevated arterial pressures. The coronaries, the small vessels supplying the heart muscle itself, bore streaks of fatty deposits, foreshadowing atherosclerosis that would have further impeded blood flow. The lung examination revealed that the right lung was fused to the chest wall by dense fibrotic adhesions, likely a consequence of repeated bouts of pulmonary edema fluid leaking into the alveoli under high vascular pressure. Clinically, Charles had reported waking in the night gasping for air, an experience now termed paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea. Such symptoms pointed unmistakably to congestive heart failure secondary to long-standing hypertension. While the concept of blood pressure as a quantifiable measure would not emerge until the mid-19th century, physicians of Charles's time did observe that excessive heat or tension in the chest signified an imbalance of the humours. Their remedy was the lancet, and indeed, during his final illness, the king endured nearly 1 pint of bloodletting on the first day alone, followed by additional phlebotomies on subsequent days. These measures, based on the belief that removing excess blood would lower the body's internal pressure, instead rendered his already overworked heart less able to maintain adequate circulation. The autopsy further disclosed that Charles's aorta showed early signs of aneurysmal dilation ballooning of the vessel under relentless strain. Had it remained in situ, this dilation might have progressed to rupture. Beneath the microscope, by later anatomical standards, the aortic wall would have revealed fragmentation of elastic fibers and accumulation of collagen, classic hallmarks of hypertensive vascular disease. In his private letters, the king lamented episodes of dizziness and faintness when rising from his throne, a phenomenon modern medicine terms orthostatic hypotension, often occurring in patients subject to repeated blood loss. He also mentioned a loud flutter in his ears after strenuous meetings, likely a sign of turbulent blood flow over stenotic valves or narrowed arteries. Despite these harbingers of cardiovascular collapse, contemporary treatments remained woefully inadequate. Physicians prescribed cooling potions of antimony and applied cold compresses to his temples, hoping to calm the boiling humours. They continued with blistering plasters on the chest, believing that drawing fluid to the skin would relieve internal congestion. Such topical remedies offered no relief for the underlying myocardial hypertrophy or vascular stiffness. In addition to destructive treatments, the king's lifestyle compounded his cardiac strain. His diet, rich in red meat and fortified wines, persisted despite admonitions to consume lighter fare. Occasional hunts and boisterous court festivities provided little sustained exercise. Rather, they alternated with prolonged periods of sedentary carriages and indoor revelry, a cycle that modern cardiologists would recognize as detrimental to heart health. By the time of his final convulsions, Charles's heart had endured decades of increased workload. The combination of hypertensive stress, atherosclerotic changes, and repeated volume loss from bloodletting created a perfect storm. His myocardium, thickened and scarred, was poorly perfused and prone to arrhythmias. When the toxic buildup from renal failure reached its zenith, the compromised heart could not maintain systemic circulation, precipitating the fatal collapse. Today, Charles II's cardiovascular saga serves as a cautionary tale. It underscores the importance of accurate diagnosis, risk factor modification, and evidence-based therapies, antihypertensive agents, dietary interventions, and controlled blood volume management that were unimaginable in the 17th century. His experience reminds us that the heart, though resilient, remains vulnerable to the silent insults of hypertension and misguided treatment, and that progress in medical understanding must accompany a commitment to patient safety and holistic care. Fifth ailment: chronic infections and internal abscesses. The hidden siege. Beyond Charles II's outward agony from gout, kidney failure, and mercury toxicity, another insidious enemy took hold: chronic infections that spawned internal abscesses. The first hints appeared as early as the winter of 1669, when the king suffered a high fever, accompanied by chills and night sweats. At the time, physicians attributed these flares to humoral corruption spreading from his gout ulcerations. Yet in retrospect, these incidents marked the initial battles in an invisible war within his body. In the years that followed, Charles experienced recurrent bouts of fever every 2 to 3 months, each lasting several days. Court records document his withdrawal to private chambers, where he lay wrapped in blankets and drank bitter infusions of rue and wormwood. Upon reprieve, he would reappear at court, pale but resolute, concealing his exhaustion behind courteous nods. Though palace physicians noted his temperature rising and falling like the tide, they lacked the means to identify the nidus of infection. The chronic inflammation around his gout sores proved a continual source of microbial invasion. Ulcerated tissue on his calves exposed to carriage dust and stagnant grooming waters became colonized by staphylococcus and streptococcus. Each flare of cellulitis sent streaks of redness inching up his legs, accompanied by throbbing pain and localized heat. When pus collected in pockets beneath the skin, incisions were made with lancets to drain it. Yet, without antisepsis or antibiotics, the wounds often failed to heal, reopening at the slightest pressure. By the spring of 1682, surgical exploration revealed deeper abscesses around his pelvic girdle. At least 2 such collections, one near the left inguinal ligament and another by the right hip, were discovered when Charles complained of sharp, radiating hip pain that hindered even the slightest turn in his carriage. Physicians made small incisions to evacuate purulent fluid, using curettes to scrape the cavity walls. Still, the abscesses recurred within weeks, the bone and soft tissue weakened by the king's compromised immunity and repeated acid urate crystal trauma. Internal abscesses, however, remained largely undetectable without imaging. It was only post-mortem, on the 7th of February in the year 1685, that Sir Charles Scarborough identified multiple purulent pockets in Charles's abdominal cavity. One lay beneath the liver's right lobe, another within the mesenteric folds near the small intestine, and a third deep among the retroperitoneal tissues adjacent to the failing kidneys. Each measured between 1 and 3 inches in diameter, filled with foul-smelling pus and bounded by thickened, inflamed membranes. These findings explained the intermittent bouts of excruciating abdominal pain the king had described in November of 1684. He would suddenly clutch his side, pale and perspiring, groaning softly in a manner charitably termed colic by his attendants. Yet this pain, unrelieved by purgatives or enemas, was the signature of an internal abscess pressing on nerves and organs. Even as abscesses festered, the systemic effects of chronic infection took their toll. Charles exhibited persistent leukocytosis by later 20th century standards, elevated white blood cell counts driving fever and malaise. He suffered bouts of tachycardia, his pulse racing above 100 beats per minute with minimal activity. Subacute bacterial endocarditis, an infection of the heart valves, may have been present, given the vegetation-like lesions found on the aortic valve during autopsy, though 17th century physicians lacked the diagnostic criteria to confirm this. Treatment of internal abscesses was rudimentary at best. Surgeons used hot cautery irons to seal incision sites after drainage, believing the heat would cauterize infection. Laudanum-laced tonics were administered to dull pain, while tonic wine fortified with antimonial powder aimed to strengthen his constitution. None addressed the underlying bacterial colonies hidden within deep tissues. Charles's nutritional status also suffered. Recurrent infections suppressed his appetite, and his restricted gout diet further limited protein intake. Malnutrition compounded immunosuppression, allowing bacteria to thrive. His attendants noted that he lost nearly 25 pounds between the summer of 1683 and the winter of 1684, leaving him gaunt and frail. In the grand tapestry of his declining health, chronic infections and internal abscesses represented the final, unrelenting siege. They contributed to his systemic exhaustion, weak heart, and impaired renal clearance, setting the stage for the convulsions that would deliver the fatal blow. At the moment of his final collapse, Charles's body harbored multiple sources of septic insult abscesses dripping poison into his bloodstream, overwhelming his already battered organs. Today, the king's battle with chronic infection offers crucial lessons. It underscores the need for sterile technique in surgery, the power of targeted antimicrobial therapy, and the importance of maintaining nutritional health in the face of prolonged illness. Charles II, whose hidden abscesses silently gnawed at him for years, reminds us that the greatest threats within the human body often lie unseen, and that true healing demands both vigilance and scientific insight. And so, as our journey through the life and trials of Charles II comes to a gentle close, we slow our pace and allow the echoes of palace halls, laboratory vapours, and whispered confidences to drift away like wisps of evening mist. In the quiet that follows, we are reminded that even the most resplendent crown can weigh heavily on its bearer, and that the greatest quests for knowledge find their truest worth only when guided by compassion, humility, and care. What then is the heart of our tale? It is a lesson that science and discovery, however noble, must walk hand in hand with responsibility and respect for human fragility. It is a testament to the power of empathy and healing that even the most ingenious treatment can become a source of suffering if it forgets the simple truth that behind everybody, no matter how exalted, there beats a human heart worthy of gentleness. And so, from the hidden chambers of Whitehall to the candlelit desks of modern laboratories, the memory of Charles's courage and his pain beckons us to honour both curiosity and caution, carrying forward a promise that our advances will strive always to relieve, not to harm. Allow these thoughts to wash over you now, like a soft rain lulling the world into stillness. Feel the tension of the day dissolve as you imagine the palace gardens at dusk roses folded into themselves, fountains murmuring a lullaby, and the distant sound of carriage wheels fading into the hush. Even the spectre of Mercury and the ache of hardened gout slip quietly into shadow, replaced by the gentle rhythm of your own breath. And as you rest your mind upon these images, know that knowledge, tempered with kindness, will always light the way forward, guiding us to a future where every discovery honors the dignity of the living. May this story's gentle whisper linger in your thoughts, a soft reminder of the ties that bind science and soul. Now, in the soft glow of night, we part with a tender invitation if you have found comfort, fascination, or perhaps simply a moment of calm in our tale. Please consider subscribing so that we may share more of these quiet journeys and thoughtful reflections with you. Let each new video be a warm hearth to gather around, where history and humanity meet in gentle conversation. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be as peaceful as a starlit pavilion, and may you wake refreshed, ready to greet the dawn with renewed wonder. Sleep well, and until we meet again, sweet, whispered slumber.